Hello and welcome to this Digital Aquarium Unreal Masterclass tutorial video. In this video we'll be looking at getting started with Unreal 5, and in today's video we'll be mainly focusing on 5.5. I'm going to launch this through the Epic Games Launcher, and it's available for free via the Epic Games website, and you will need to have an account if you want to activate it this way. I'm going to press launch. As you can see, it also shows my previous projects within this window, so I could theoretically click on any of those to open up those projects. Now, this does take a while depending on your system, and once this has loaded, we should see the Unreal Project Browser. This allows us to, once again, see our previous projects, but we can also select templates to work from games to film, so motion design, virtual production, and display systems architecture for architectural visualizations and augmented reality, product design, and simulation, which typically in this case is handheld AR, and virtual reality. I'm just today though just going to go select the games template, just because this is just a getting started video. And as you can see, we have the options for Blueprint or C++. If you're using 5.4, you'll have the option also for ray tracing. As of 5.5 though, you don't have that option. It is on by default, and you can always change that within the editor property window settings anyway. You choose your target platform. I'm going to choose desktop. If you have Android or iOS, you can also have these options down here. But again, we can select that in the editor itself, so don't worry about that for now. Choose your quality preset. I'm going to go with maximum because my PC can handle it. But if you want a low spec machine, you may want to go for scalable, which means some features may be disabled, but can also be enabled at a later date if needs be. If you want the project to include some starter content, which includes things like a chair, a door frame, and some starting materials, you can click the little tick box there. And again, you can always add this in later, so don't worry too much if you forget to do this. Select your project location. To change that location, you press the folder and choose your desired save location. And we're going to give our project a name, and I'm just going to call this Getting Started. Do not have any spaces and do not use any punctuation marks, because it does not like it. I'm just going to press create, and now it will load up our editor. This again may take some time as it has to compile shaders and load your scene. The more assets your environment does have, the longer this will also take. Okay. So we are now opened up our editor. I'm just going to reset my window to show you the defaults that will come up to. So if you ever want to reset the editor layout, you can just go to Window, Load Layout, and select the default editor layout, and it will return to its default look, like so. And I'm just going to go through each of these panels in kind of brief detail. At the top up here, we have our main control panel. We have Save Current Level. We can browse our content browser for another level. We have our selection modes. So each of these here will change the editor mode that we're in. So for example, in selection mode, it's your design for building your level. So adding in assets, moving things around, that sort of thing. Our landscape tool, which we'll look at in a future video, is for building landscapes with height maps, so terrain like mountains and valleys. Our foliage tool, again, it's a clues in the name, it's for adding in foliage, trees, grass, that sort of thing. Mesh paint is where we can paint onto meshes, again, self-explanatory. Modeling allows us to pull vectors and vertices to be able to shift and shape objects. This doesn't work with all objects, so just bear in mind, if you're still modeling, you still want to be doing your models in a dedicated 3D modeling program, but we can go through that again in a future video. Our fracture tool is if we want to have any physics objects that would shatter or break upon impact, Or, for example, if we're making a shooting game, break once we sort of shoot at the glass, for example. Brush editing, this is for editing our brushes. So I'll explain what a brush is in a bit, but essentially, again, we can adjust the vertices and the edges and stretch and skew things within the Unreal Editor. And our animation mode is for creating animation and keyframing sort of workflows. We won't be going for the animation workflow in this video, but we can look at it potentially down the line. The next button along on the top is our Add Actors panel. We can click on the drop down to open up a selection of options. So this is where we can find our actors like lights, shapes. So shapes are essentially static meshes. Static meshes are what our 3D models are. They are, for example, if we was to create a model in something like Blender or 3ds Max and we exported it as a FBX or OBJ, that would be our static mesh. A static mesh is not the same as a volume, so a static mesh doesn't necessarily have collision. And you can also animate static meshes, whereas volumes you cannot. We have cinematic options for if we want to bring in special cameras. So for virtual production, we would potentially look at things like our camera rail systems and cranes if you want more fluid motion. So any of the cinematographers out there will happily know that you can add in custom cameras, and those cameras you can change things like the focal length, the aperture, the lens, and the shutter speed of those cameras. A media plate is for if we're bringing in any videos. So if we have any video content that's going to be on a material, that would be through a media plate. Visual effects, so this is for decals. For reflection, so if we're using lighting and we need to be able to capture that lighting and bounce it back into the environment without using as many lights, we can use these reflection captures here. We have something that's called fog. So whenever you play a video game, you'll notice that things very far in the distance aren't as in focus and aren't as rendered as well. And typically you'll see what looks like a mist or fog in the background. That's so it doesn't have to load any things beyond it. And it allows us to have a natural kind of fall off. As if you look on the horizon and you start to see the horizon's sort of more grey, and as it blends from the land into the sky, local fog volume allows us to do that alongside our exponential height fog. Volumetric clouds, those are for clouds in the sky, essentially, for our environment, sky atmosphere. So that's for simulating light and the sky within our sphere. So that would be our HDRIs, for example. And our post-process volume is a volume that when we enter or we have the camera enter this environment, we can have things like the color values change or apply visual effects to the camera or screen. Geometry. Geometry is not the same as these basic shapes up here, but geometry is volume. So these by default will have collision. And I'll go for those again in more detail, but just bear in mind, these are not static meshes. These should be treated differently. Volumes. These are where we can set things like a kill box. So if we was to, let's say, fall off the map, instead of the player falling at the world forever, we could set a kill box volume below the map. So once the player enters that area, the player would basically die and the level would respawn, for example. And triggers. So triggers are where we can activate a function once we enter a certain area. And we can look at that when we're looking at the blueprint in a later video. All shows everything. And then at the very bottom, we have the option to select the Place Actors panel. I personally like doing that because I quite like to have it docked on this side. And because of the way Unreal works, everything can be moved. So if you don't like where something's located, you can simply click it, drag it to where you want it, to what works best for your own workflow. It is entirely customizable. The next button along at the top is our Blueprints window. I'm not going to go too much into the blueprints in the first few videos in this series, but these are essentially our if this then that kind of node-based controls that would dictate what kind of game mode we've got, what the rules are, how things operate, whether anything changes over time, etc., etc. The next one, which is a little clapperboard, this is our level sequence. So a level sequence is essentially a animation timeline, but it can be triggered or activated based on either a trigger in the space or upon loading of the level itself. And again, we'll go through the differences between a level sequence and an animation sequence in a future video that's dedicated to that workflow. Next along, we have our play controls. So we have play. By the way, any moment that you want to know what the shortcut is, just simply hover your mouse over the tool and it will tell you if it has a shortcut or not. So hovering your mouse over something will give you more information and give you contextual cues. So you've got your play, which will also turn into your pause, which plays in your editor by default. You can simulate. So if you press the simulate button, things will still activate within the scene as if they would that you're playing. But anything you do within the simulation view does not carry across. So if any changes you do here will not actually be stored. So just bear that in mind. And you can always stop to reset. So escape on the keyboard will return you back to the editor mode. This little menu button here next to these play controls changes the way that you play. So you can set it to play within this viewport, or you can have it play in a new window. If you have a VR headset plugged in and you have the VR software in the background, so if it's for example, a HTC Vive and you have Steam VR running in the background, you can preview your scene in VR using the VR preview. We will not be covering this in these videos, but this is an option if you are making something in VR. And again, we have a lot of other options here, things like quick launch, which again, if you've got it on different machines plugged into a network, you could actually launch on different machines and have one machine for previewing whilst you're working on another one. Platforms, so this is where you select what your editor is going to be packaged for. For the purposes of these workshops, we're only going to be focusing on the Windows. We're not going to be packaging this for Android or iOS. If you are packaging it for mobile devices, you would also need to have the SDKs for those devices installed on your machine alongside the developer license. If you want to know more about that, I'm happy to discuss that or cover that in a future session if needs be. Also at the top here, we have our settings. Our settings tab allows us to change things that affect the entire world. So everything that we see in our environment. Our project, which is the entire package that we would zip up or deploy at the end. We can also use this to change things like the project name or the custom thumbnail when it loads up, alongside the control mechanisms that we use. We will cover this again in a later video. Plugins. So if I click on the plugins, this is where we can add in extra plugins. So if there's a feature we're missing or there's a particular piece of hardware that we have, we can search for the plugin here. So let's say water. I can enable my water plugin here. And then depending on whether it would need to relaunch the editor or not, that feature would then be added to our project. At the very top here, you've got your standard tools. So zip project, if you want to be able to transfer your project to another machine. So to take your project to another machine, if you want to continue working elsewhere, you need to zip it up first. That will zip up all the content in the content drawer. If you just copy the folder as is onto another machine, all the links in your content drawer would actually not work. So you do need to zip it if you are moving between machines whilst editing. Edit. So your cut, paste, delete, and again, your editor preferences and project preferences are all here again. Window. So if there are any windows we want to bring up, for example, when we do the virtual production, we have a thing called Live Link. We can bring up those particular tabs and panels within this window layer. Tools. These are these are a bit more advanced things, but these is where for if you're working with scripts or you want to run set profiles, or do debugging systems. Again, we're not going to be going too much into any of this stuff. but it's also where you can add things like creating C++ classes or custom code to run on top of the engine. You've got your build tool. So before ray tracing and Lumen and Nanite became what it is essentially back in Unreal 3 and 4 and earlier, you used to have to build your lighting every time you made a change to be able to see it in action. If, however, you deploy your level and it still comes up with lighting needs to be rebuilt, you can go up here to build and go to where is it? You can build lighting. You can set things like build lighting only or build the entire geometry. Again, this is you can toggle what you want to build, and that will basically confirm any changes you've done and update the editor and the playback for you. Select. These are various tools for selecting objects. So if you want to select all your lights, you can use that button there, and it'll select all the lights in your scene. And again, these have shortcuts. So I can select everything in my scene by pressing Shift-A. Actor. This is where we can edit things like the visibility of actors or the pivot point of actors, or attach actors to particular maps or areas. Again, we're not going to be covering this in this video, but we will be looking at this again down the line. And then help, if you ever get lost or confused, there is obviously online support and documentation that guide you through it, including the learning library and forums that will help you if you really get stuck or you've got a very niche, bespoke use case. So that's this top menu kind of covered. The next panel I'm going to go through, I'm not going to go through the place actors panel because this is essentially the same as what this drop down here would be, but it can be a little bit more convenient for certain people like myself. This middle window here, this is our editor window. So everything that we want to build, everything we want to change, everything we want to see, this is our building window. To move around our window, we would hold the right mouse button to pan the camera around. If we press WASD whilst holding the right mouse button, we can rotate and move around. So using the combination of the right mouse button and WASD, we can rotate around, zoom in, fly around our scene. Like so. Left mouse button selects things that we click on, or if we're in our outliner, which is this window over here, which, by the way, our outliner shows everything that's within our current level. We can select those objects also within this outliner. And if we want to zoom to them really quickly or we ever get lost, we can select an object in our scene, hit the key shortcut F, and that will take us to that object in our level. Or we can do the same by double-clicking on the object in our outliner. The next thing we're going to look at in this window is these tools up here. So we have our select. So this is how we can just select objects. We won't be able to move them or anything in this mode, but we can at least have them highlighted. If we want to move anything, we can press W or the move and translate tool. And once we select an object now, we will see these three axes which is anchored to the pivot point of the object. Depending on which object and how the model was set up will depend on where that pivot point is, so just bear that in mind. But I can drag these handles to move along the X, Y, or Z. I can also change these values within the details panel, which is over here, below the outliner by default. The details panel will change depending contextually on what you have selected. So because I have a static mesh selected, all the values here are for static mesh for things like materials or whether it has physics or no physics applied. Physics meaning if I press simulate, it actually will have gravity. If I was to rerun it with the physics off, it will now just float and not actually have any weight applied to it, for example. But if I was to, let's say, select my light, so I'm going to go for my directional light in my scene. You can see here now the details have changed to give me things like intensity, so how bright my light is, how much influence it's having, what colour that light is within my scene, the angle of that light, whether it's adjusting the temperature of the environment and scene, and whether it casts shadows, etc., etc. This also brings me on to the next tool along here is we can also rotate objects. So that's with the shortcut E, or this little rotate button up here. And again, we've got our three axes, X, Y, and Z. We can hold one of these and drag it to rotate our values. The unique thing to bear in mind is if you're using a directional light and you have a sky atmosphere in, it will actually also change things like the position of the sun in the sky within this default template. But we can create and do that again if we need to in other tools that don't have this feature enabled. So just bear in mind, you want to ideally set a template that is closest to what you're going to be end result is intention is going to be to make your life a lot easier. But if you don't want to use that, again, in the details panel, you could adjust these values manually and it'll do exactly the same thing. If we press R, this will bring up our scale tool. So we're going to select this cube here again because it's nice and obvious. We can drag these handles to scale it on each axis. Control Z to undo, by the way. Or if you select the white cube in the middle on any of these tools, it will select all three axes at the same time and scale everything proportionately. Another way of doing this, again, is within the details panel, is where it says scale. You'll notice that this one has a little padlock. If I click on that padlock and then change one of these values, all those values will change the same. If I have that padlock unlocked and then I change one of them, it only changes it on that one axis. If I have something selected in my scene and I want it to be on the floor or the world grid base, I just simply press the keyboard shortcut End and it will drop it to the world floor. I will provide a list of shortcuts on the Digital Aquarium website because there's quite a lot. So there is actual tools and shortcuts you can use. For example, if I have this volume here selected, actually, no, I'll select this cube again, sorry. If I have this cube selected and I hold V whilst I move it, you will see on my screen I have these little blue squares appearing everywhere. These are vertices. So holding V, I can use, I'm dragging it around, I can lock it to a vertices. So this will lock our object to the next nearest vertices, but bear in mind it does take into account the pivot location of an object. So because the pivot location on this cube is in the middle, the anchor for it would be in the middle to the nearest vertices. We can cycle between whether any gizmo changes we do are world affecting or local, based clicking on this little world here. And again, we'll explain what that is on the Digital Aquarium website. We can control whether objects snap to services by this button here. If I click on service snapping, it will now, it should try to snap potentially. Can be quite tricky to tell sometimes. So just bear in mind that. We have these values here. So everything that's blue is enabled. If it's not blue, it's not enabled. So this changes, for example, the amount of increments it happens per move. So if I was to move this object, at the moment it's moving it 10 units a time. I can check if I change that to, let's say, 100 and then try moving it. Now it's going to move it 100 units each time. 100 units in Unreal is roughly 1 meter. So I can use these values here to adjust how much my rotation snaps, how much my scale snaps, and how much my movement snaps. If I want to move something not on a snap point, I can click on the tool here to disable the snapping feature, and now I have minute control of it, and it's not snapping between values, it can go in between values. Next tool along here is our camera speed. So if you find that when you're moving around that the camera's a bit fast, you can go to our camera speed here, pull it down, and now when I move, the camera is going to move a lot slower. So depending on how you feel comfortable and what works best for you, you can adjust these values to suit your particular workflow. I didn't talk about these over here, but I will do now. We have this little menu here where we can adjust things like showing the frame rate or the field of view within our editor window, alongside adding things like allowing camera shakes to happen or adjusting our default layouts. We have perspective. So by default, this view is in perspective, but I can adjust it to be a top-down view, or I can have it to be a left view. By the way, when I do adjust it to these values, these views, it does change this option next to it, which is our view mode. Our view mode is what is basically how it's displaying that content to us. So wireframe shows us how complex the models are and the edges of those models. But I can also, if I go to lit, that is the sort of default lighting of our scene. Unlit means the lights are not actually affecting our environment. You can have a lit wireframe, which is the lighting is still being shown, but the wireframe is being detailed, and so on and so on. There's a lot here. I'm just going to stick to lit, and I'm just going to go back to perspective for this view. And the show option here is if you want things to be hidden or shown in your scene, like decals or volume cubes, you can toggle them on or off using the tools here. And again, personal preference depends on what you want to show or not show. As your scene gets more complicated, you may want to hide certain things when you're not working on them, for example. One thing I quite like doing sometimes is I will quite often toggle between my viewport view. So up here, if I click on this little grid of 4, this will open up 4 separate windows. So I can have my perspective view, I can have my top view, and my right and left views at the same time. And again, I can still change these to be in different, to show me different values. And this is quite useful when you're building quite big, complicated environments to check that everything is in line where you want it to be, and there's nothing kind of creeping out, and there's no lighting details that have been bouncing outside the environment that could be eating up system memory. And we can always go back to maximize any of these viewpoints by clicking the square here. So if I click on this one, for example, it maximizes that window. But if I go back to my perspective one and click on in that corner, it maximizes my perspective view. So the last important window I'm going to go through here is our content drawer. So that you can, this is down here at the bottom, you can either click on the button or you can press Control Space to bring it up. Our content drawer is where all of our custom content, so whenever we want to create materials, blueprints, bring in meshes, bring in decals, videos, any content that we want to bring into our scene, we need to add to our content drawer. A rule of thumb is to try and keep this ordered and organized. So I can right click in my content drawer to create folders, for example. So I could have a folder for 3D assets, can't have spaces, so underscore assets. And then I can have a folder for, let's say, room 1 bedroom. You just want to make sure that your folders are logical, make sense to your workflow. On the add button, so if you want to bring content in, you can click add. And this is where you can add in, again, all of our active properties are here. So things like a live link blueprint or create a emitter or create a blueprint. You can have those options here, but the most basic assets are here. These are ones that we most commonly be using. You can also add feature or content packs. So if I click on that, you can bring in content from other blueprints or from other content. So you can always add in a virtual reality template into our scene, or we could add in our starter content if we forgot to do it at the beginning, for example. Fab. So in the older versions of Unreal, we use something called Quixel Bridge. Quixel Bridge has now been replaced with a tool called Fab. So if I click on that, Fab is an online library that is owned by Epic. And it allows you to gain access to a repository of 3D assets, animations, brushes, environments, textures, custom plugins and scripts, and so on. You would need to sign into this separately. So where's a little person here, and you need to sign into this within this window. Fab is also a website. So we can go to fab.com and download the assets from there. Bearing in mind, this is basically a store, so some of these assets do have prices attached to them, but there is also quite a lot of free content on there, and they do vary up the free content quite a lot. So you can always go to price, filter by free, and it'll just show you all that content that's currently freely available to play about with and explore. And if I wanted any of that in my scene, I just simply click on it. Oops, sorry, not the manufacturer. I want to click on the content. Let me just go back. Press the wrong button there. Apologies. Let's go back to free. So I can click on that. I would select my license. So I'm only using this for educational purposes. So I can select personal free, add to project, and then this would import it into my content browser, and I can start using those assets in my scene. If I want to lock my content drawer, so it's always at the bottom, which is again something that I personally quite like doing, you can always press the Dock in Layout button. This will now mean it's always locked at the bottom of our scene, and it can make life a bit easier when you have to keep adding in multiple assets over a long time. Our Import button is where we would be able to navigate to our custom content, so that's an FBX, an OBJ, and essentially any of these type of formats here. You can import them in, and it will bring up a window with options. Again, we'll go through that when we actually look at building our world. Save all saves any changes we've done to any of our assets. And settings over here, again, are settings contextually for this, so things like the size of the thumbnails, whether the thumbnails update when you do changes to the content, whether you want the content to be shown as lists or as tiles. Again, whatever works for yourself is options here. If you find that when you are working in your Unreal environment that you start to have stuttering or performance issues, if we go to settings and we go to engine scalability settings, we can adjust how much rendering power our machine is having. So how things like how much memory is being dedicated to things like shadows and texture details and reflections. And we can adjust those individually. Cinematic being the highest setting and epic, and low being the lowest. We can also create a custom menu in the final product to allow people to adjust this, which again we'll do at the very end of the workflow series. You can also adjust things like material if you just want to adjust materials, and that will save you time. When you're editing, you don't need to see everything in high. It's only when you deploy something that you may want it to look its best. Okay. Our output log, it would show us or details of what's going on in the system, any errors or crashes that are happening. So this is a good tool for those who are system-minded. And if something goes wrong, you can usually use this to copy and search for what that error could be or what's caused it. And command is for those who are kind of familiar with console commands. Again, we're not going to go through that, but this is an option in there. Revision control is where you can connect a revision control system. So if you're working on a server, you could save multiple versions, like an iterative process. And yeah, so like I said, the main things to take away from this is everything is contextual. So details panel changes depending on what we have selected. If we have something selected, you can still add things to it. So you can nestle objects into each other. We're not going to do that in this video, but we'll talk about why we'll do that in the future. And our content drawer is where we import all of our files. Most important thing here is trying to keep to a good naming convention. So, for example, Unreal, they tend to have M underscore and then the material's name. Although a lot of people in the Unreal community will also just use mat underscore and the material name to distinguish the fact that it is a material and not a texture or a 3D object. Because when you're working through a lot of files, it can get quite complicated. If you just want to search for a certain type of file, so you can filter your content drawer, click on the little filter button here, and I can say, I only want you to show all my materials, and now only my materials are showing in the content drawer. If I want to turn that filter off, I simply click on that filter name again, and it takes us back to our normal viewpoint. So when we've finished working on our level, we need to make sure that we press Save Current Level As to save our level. If we are creating a new level, so that we would use File, New Level, we would select the new level template we want to work with, for example, Basic. I don't want to save anything changes there because I didn't do anything I want to save. And it is always good practice by default when you open up a new project to go File, New Level and work on a new level, not the default level that the map opens up in. Because if the project corrupts, it will mean that you can't, and it means when it tries to open up that corrupted file, you will not be able to fix it because the default map that the starting map is will actually be corrupted and the project will never be able to, you won't be able to recover the project. If you create a new level and that level itself is corrupted, you would still be able to get into the project and be able to potentially fix it without having to start from scratch again. If you are moving your project between machines, as I said earlier, zip your project, and then you can transfer that machine to another machine by unzipping that folder and just double-clicking on the U project within that folder. So hopefully this gives you a kind of brief oversight of the interface. There is a lot to unpack, and we will go into more details as we explore each tool individually down the road. So, for example, there is a separate panels and viewpoints for things like windows, for materials, and so on. And we'll look at things, the different modes and the options as we go through those elements in future videos. Thank you for watching, and continue watching the Unreal Masterclass series here on the Digital Aquarium website. Thank you.